The great game of our time is a three-party game. It is US, China, and Russia. And while we look at areas like the Middle East and we look at countries that are evolving like Israel, Vietnam, so on and so forth, the real game ultimately is the game between these three powers because they are the only powers that have the capability of operating militarily on a very broad scale, theoretically, globally, as well as having significant economies, large sizes, and everything else. So for our era, this is the great game, how this plays out. The United States is going through one of its cycles where the country is deeply divided and there's fundamental questions of how power will emerge, but not very much questions that we're going to be changing our institutions in several ways because they have, as I've argued in the past, become obsolete. They no longer work. There's one fundamental there that's worth mentioning. The United States has many independent organizations, entities, which preside over finances, preside over health, and so on and so forth. The president, under the law, does not have any authority over them. Thus, given the fact that the president is the central foundation, we have many organizations like this that are not answerable to anyone who is elected. In other words, this is a very strange evolution. This has been institutionalized really since World War II, having these organizations. And when you look at it, and I really couldn't care less about these organizations, so I don't really mind it, but it really violates the Constitution because there are three branches of government: the presidency, the legislative, the judiciary. These organizations are not answerable to any of them, except for whatever limits Congress placed on them, and therefore took away presidential power. So the United States is in an institutional crisis, as was predicted, and needs to structure this. And the level of loathing between these two sectors and within these sectors is profound. There's also a culture war going on, an economic war going on, and therefore our relationships with other countries is seen very differently. One faction wants to reduce the amount of exposure the United States has to wars. The other faction wants to be more deeply involved in the world. The argument of the anti-wars faction, which right now is the right wing, which used to be the left wing, was anti-war, is that we cannot be responsible for constantly being involved in wars. That is, we've been from the Korean War down to Afghanistan, constantly in war in the past 80 years, and it should end. The other statement is, if we withdraw from the world will become a much more dangerous place for us. Therefore, a forward strategy, as we followed in the Cold War, is more rational. Either way you play it, by a very small margin, the president was elected, larger electoral college, but by numbers, small. And this crisis was predictable and is going on. Therefore, at this moment in history, all three of the major powers are in the midst of fundamental crises. That also means that when they interact, it is based on these crises, in part, that they do. The American position is we want to put limits on our exposure economically and militarily to the world. Hence the tariffs, to limit the level of vulnerability the United States has, as China has just experienced, to other countries, and the military aspect as well as trying to play a role which doesn't quite fit Trump, but he does fairly well, of being a pacifist. He's the one who wants to get the Nobel Prize. That's his claim for it. But more importantly, he's actually engaged in stopping wars. It's not because he's a pacifist, it's because these wars are dangerous to the United States. They may draw us in. On the other hand, there's a faction who's saying he's simply postponing the inevitable. And then there's the personal vendettas that are going back and forth that are there. So the United States is in that crisis. Russia is in a crisis of having entered a war that expected to win in a few months and has not managed to do so in almost 4 years, as well as continuing to take massive casualties at the front while not gaining any further power, terrain. No way to end the war except to admit defeat. They cannot do this. China, at the same time, is facing a fundamental problem. So, what is the imperative of Russia? The imperative of Russia is to try to find an opening under which it can reach a settlement that allows it to appear to have won the war. In other words, more of Ukraine. The Ukrainians doing very well are not going to let that happen. So he can't achieve his imperative. The Chinese imperative is, please God, get me out of having these tariffs on me. Every time I turn around, crazy Trump raises them again. Why is Trump raising tariffs, particularly on China? And my theory is all the other tariffs were primarily intended to justify the tariffs on China. That was the one we were dealing with. Why? Because China has become a fundamental economic necessity for the United States. At the same time that it holds a hostile relationship militarily to the United States. This is an untenable thing. I've talked about this before, how the Arab oil embargo almost wrecked the American economy in the 70s and was a great contributor to the crisis of the 1970s. So there are now two levels of talks going on between the United States and China. There are the economic talks that are quietly going on. There are also now military consultations that are going on. The American view is, unless the Chinese stop appearing to be aggressive, in point of fact, they're not very aggressive at all, but stop appearing to be aggressive, we cannot allow ourselves to become dependent on you. And so these negotiations have to end, from the American point of view, with China changing its foreign policy, particularly to the United States. The United States is prepared, as with Russia, to do business with China. Now, one of the interesting things in the past few months, aside from everything else, is the reduction of Chinese exercises in the Pacific Ocean. Also, where a few months ago we saw constant blockades being thrown on Taiwan, they've stopped doing that. They also have another problem, which is that Japan is emerging as a major military power. The new prime minister has said they want to increase the amounts they're spending on military defenses dramatically, far beyond what the Americans asked for. China and Japan have a long-standing bad relationship. After World War II, Japan was impotent, China was disinterested, it was fine. Suddenly, Japan is emerging. The United States backing away. It does not want to have, China does not want to have this relationship with Japan. They have very bad histories. So what you see going on in the world here is the three major countries are simultaneously in internal economic and political crises. That makes the situation less predictable, potentially more dangerous, or potentially less dangerous. Less dangerous in the sense that everybody's focused on the inside, except for the interest for the Chinese, for the American access, the interest of Russia for the rest of Ukraine. But the United States itself is looking at the situation from a more distant point, and therefore, in some ways, its internal crisis is more intense.
For the full recording and much more, go to geopoliticalfutures.com/ClubGPF.